Good afternoon, friends. Stephen Benoon here, and I am joined with Sameerah Munshi, who is a former appointee, presidential appointee, and White House Religious Liberties Commission advisor. And she has joined us here today. And what makes Sameerah's story so remarkable isn't just her recent resignation in protest of the injustice and atrocity she witnessed while on this commission, but it's in fact that through her tenure, she refused to accept government travel funds, choosing to stand as a truly independent voice that could not be bought or silenced by the administration. That is just speaks volumes in my mind, especially with so much APAC controlled lobbyists that seem to control every politician. Granted, an appointee is not a politician, but still, nonetheless, they like to control everything. So she watched from the inside, and as a commission meant to protect all Americans was, in her words, in one interview, was hijacked by the Zionist political agenda and used to launch an unconstitutional war in Iran. I so agree with you on that. Samira, you said you support America over Israel as we see it as well. And today, and we're going to find out exactly what that has cost you thus far. Thank you for being here, and my sincere condolences, though, for all the flack that you no doubt have had to go through
I
because of
appreciate
your
you having
bold and
me.
brave stance.
Mhm.
So, how do people, just so we get, so you know how it is, Samira, people will watch an interview and they might stay in here for 5 minutes or so and then they move on unless something really captures their attention. So I want though, if people can, how can they follow you? I know you're on X. Is there any other platforms that you are on?
Yeah, so I'm on X. I mainly post on there, but I also have an Instagram account. This handles are the same at Sameerah Munshi, just my first and last. And I also have a Substack that I haven't really posted on, but I plan on posting more in the future.
Excellent, excellent. So I'll put those also, guys, in the description below for you. We'll also run this on Israeli News Live website. I hate to say that we still call it that, but so many people said maybe it helps to reach people that otherwise would not be reached. But let me start off here. Samara, most people in Washington are fighting for the influence and perks, and you specifically refuse to travel reimbursement for your work on this commission. Why was it so important for you to remain financially independent from the body you were advising?
I mean, I think most people know like money equals influence. So I think for me, maybe people have, I discussed this with some of my family members and other people, and they're like, oh, it's just reimbursement for travel. Like that doesn't mean you're taking money from the government. That doesn't mean you're taking money from these people. But for me, I think I felt that as a Muslim and my principles as a person of faith, I was not comfortable accepting any money tied to, the government and what I perceive as its, role in the genocide in Gaza. I just felt that even though I was, working to be a part of influence, being a part of shaping policy and shaping executive orders by the government, I didn't think that meant that I had to fully, be complicit in their actions or fully accept what they're doing. And I felt like refusing monetary compensation, I felt like that was the right thing to do. And many Muslim scholars also speak to there's a debate within the Muslim community on whether how much and whether Muslims should interact with governments. And I, was reading some works of different scholars, and something that really stood out to me is Imam Ahmed, who is one of the prominent imams of our tradition. He refused any funds from the government, and I felt really inspired by him, and so I also decided to not take a penny from them.
That's amazing. It really is. And myself, I come from a Jewish birth background. I am a believer as far as, my personal beliefs as far as Jesus, but I have such respect, regardless of what people choose in religion and life. To me, that's what America was founded on in the first place. And we'll get into that in just a little bit here. You've spoken about the quote unquote clown show and the mockery of your faith that took place behind closed doors. Was this specific moment where you realized that the commission was no longer interested in protecting religious liberty, but was instead demanding a theological alignment with Zionism?
I think there were, I mean, obviously a lot of red flags for me that ultimately led to my decision. But one of the biggest things for me was this intervention meeting that they had with Carrie that she's talked about many times, where they pulled in Carrie to essentially try to silence her and intimidate her to not speak about Palestine during the hearing on anti-Semitism, even though that the witnesses that were chosen for that hearing were all pro-Israel and all spoke about Israel in some capacity on stage that day. I felt really concerned that, if people like this are going to be the ones that are trying to, I mean, as an advisor, all I can do is talk and hope they listen. And so if these are the people that I'm hoping to listen to me, I didn't feel like they could. If anything, Carrie was the only commissioner who was actually listening to what I said and was actually, actively trying to work with me to have my recommendations, seen on the commission. And when she was fired, I felt like there was nothing I could do. None of them would be receptive to my words and receptive to the needs of the Muslim community, especially with all of the hateful rhetoric that many of the commission members have pushed themselves. Dan Patrick, Lieutenant Governor of Texas, he has listed as one of his priorities for the coming year to, I believe, eradicate Sharia from Texas, which if anyone understands Sharia law and anyone understands the First Amendment in general, no religious law can be instituted as the law of the land. So all of this legislation around Sharia law is symbolic legislation meant to specifically, target and create hatred towards Muslims. So I mean, it's a non-issue, honestly. So for him, and then Eric Metaxas has said vile things about Muslims that publicly that I won't repeat. One thing he did say from the stage is that all of the religions are interested in religious liberty, but not Islam. I think when you're trying to speak to someone like that and have him represent your views as a Muslim and pass on those views to the president, there's no way that someone like that would ever, care about the religious liberty of Muslims.
Well, to your point with Dan Patrick, just today it came out. My wife, Yana Benoon, and she under her maiden name Satova, she posted on Twitter, and I also reshared it. I saw it myself. Dan Patrick was actually surrounded by Chabad rabbis, and not just rabbis, but of the Jewish community, a huge group there embracing and endorsing the seven Noahide laws, which I don't know how much you're aware of that, Samir, but if they, I hear so much this talk about, oh, Sharia law, everybody's got to be afraid of Sharia law. I'm more concerned about Noahide laws than I am Sharia law, because the Noahide laws is capital punishment. And pretty much, if you believe that Jesus is the Messiah, there's many rabbis that have attested to it, very well known, Rabbi Mizrahi, and I don't normally call him rabbi, but for the sake of this, I'll say some, Tovia Singer as well. They're all saying that Christians and Hindus of India, and they name other religions, are all pagan worshippers and according to their law ought to die. That's Sharia law, and Dan Patrick was sitting there endorsing it right there today in Texas. So why would he then put one above make his crusade to get rid of Sharia law when he's embracing a law that would make Sharia law look like Sunday school laws?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it really speaks to the Zionist influence in our politics. And I've said many times the Islamophobia that we're seeing with, representatives like Randy Fine and Andy Ogles, I don't think it's from this inherent fear of Muslims or in any, reading of our religion, and then they're, concerned with some of his teachings. I think it's directly tied to Zionist influence, and it's directly tied to Israeli propaganda against Muslims. And we've seen this with the Israeli Foreign Ministry itself, commissioning Stagwell Global, a survey and research organization, on methods of how that they can increase the support for Israel and how they can reform the Israeli image. And one of the things that they did point to explicitly, and this is documented, Dropsite News, I think, had an article about it. I think that Haaretz also mentioned, the Israeli influence in Congress, that specifically one of their avenues to increase or to reform the Israeli image is to target Muslims and to create this increased fear of radical Islamic terrorism and paint Islam as a dangerous religion. Because once you prop up this boogeyman of, oh, Muslims are bad, Islam is bad, then you're not looking at the war crimes that they're committing in Gaza against Muslims. You're not looking at the atrocities that they're committing against Muslims. It's a distraction game. It's the way to, get people to not question them when they're just shifting the blame onto another community.
I see that 100% in what you're saying, and I've noticed that as well, that they want to shift all the blame on Muslims and focus on Sharia law. And, just like they talk about, oh, well, Biden, as Trump calls him, Sleepy Joe, led all the terrorists through the southern border. And they were all Muslims. Well, no, there were Chinese, there were all kinds of nationalities coming across the southern border. But I was on an interview recently, and someone said, well, all these Iranian terrorists came through the southern border. I said, that's completely false. I said, there's no evidence of Iranians coming through our southern border. Maybe some of the Muslim Brotherhood that Trump and Obama and them are using, like to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, which I consider to be one of the greatest presidents of Syria in modern times. But in the case of Iran, I said most of the people from Iran that are here are from pre-1979. Those are the families. I meet them every day right in Dallas, and they're just the sweetest people you'd ever want to meet. Uh, but to the point here that, like you said, it's become a way to detract from what Israel is doing. As you pointed out, and I agree 100%, Israel is committing genocide. And what really has troubled me, Samira, maybe you could speak to this, is I know it's a little off topic, but I still think it's important. Why hasn't the world come together and demanded that Israel stop? Why did America continue to fund them? Why is it that Trump just, he's in negotiations with Iran, cuts off the negotiations because Israel's already bombed and killed the Ayatollah, and yet at the same time, Israel is, with no pushback at all, completely genociding the Palestinian people. And of course, I will say this: I hold Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben Gvir, and the rest of his leadership over there responsible for October the 7th. They say, "Oh, aren't you going to condemn what Hamas did on October the 7th?" I'm like, I live there. I know what Israel's like. I was there during the Intifada. I know how fast Israel can respond. And you mean to tell me it took them 6 hours to get there while it was being live streamed on Al Jazeera? No, somebody let that happen, and there's actually some questions behind that too. I'll go into that in a different broadcast, but it was to me nothing but to justify this genocide that they intended to do, and they're getting away with it, and nobody's doing anything about it.
I mean, I think one of the reasons, sorry, there is the right here, but I think one of the reasons why we're not seeing any more backlash than we already have, particularly from governments, is because of this strong Israeli influence in places of power. So I think like we're seeing with the United States. I think the Gallup poll that came out a couple weeks ago says that Americans are more sympathetic to Palestinians than Israelis for the first time in American history, and we're seeing that the American people don't want this war. Overwhelmingly, the American people don't want this war in Iran, but the people in power are constantly voting for it. War Powers Act didn't pass, in Congress, in the Senate and the House. They voted it down, and we're seeing that people in power are not actually representing the people on the ground. So I think that's kind of what's happening, that these people in the upper echelons of government and societies are the ones that are kind of calling the shots, even though the people themselves aren't in line with it. Spain is the only country that we've seen come out very publicly. They withdrew their ambassador from Tel Aviv. They now have a Palestinian ambassador, and they recognize Palestine as a state. But I don't think that's happening with a lot of other European countries because of the pressure that they have from the Israeli lobby. And I'm more familiar with the Israeli lobby in the United States, but I would love to see if there's any information that you have, or any information about the Israeli lobby abroad, because I think that is also very influential, and that they can't get away with something like this. If it was any other country in the world, they wouldn't be able to do this. But I think because Israel has systematically built up its support very strategically, then that's kind of how they're getting away with it. And specifically by suppressing the people and their voice, by these governments suppressing free speech on Palestine. I think we have boycott laws in 36, I believe 36 states, that, just businesses are not allowed to boycott Israel. Otherwise, they'll have their funding withdrawn from the United States. That's insane. A majority of the United States in 36 states where we can't even boycott. It's peaceful, nonviolent resistance to the atrocities that we see happening, and that's not even allowed. Like that to me is it's suppression, and it doesn't make any sense that these laws still exist. But I think that speaks to how much Israeli influence has suppressed the voices of the average person who doesn't want genocide, who doesn't want to support a genocide, and is able to kind of work their way into these governments and work their way into global acceptance by sheer intimidation.
You're so right. And the thing is in Europe, it seems that Germany, mostly Germany and England are probably the two that are really controlled by the Israeli lobby inside their countries. And I'm not sure if they have the same type of situation like we have AIPAC, that funds all these candidates. That's one reason why I really highly respected Marjorie Taylor Greene when I saw that she had never taken AIPAC money. I had no idea of that. But that's where the problem is, and unfortunately, practically every single politician in the United States takes money from AIPAC, and so they're controlling the narrative. Now, fortunately, we are starting to see a change. The American people are starting to come out in numbers to vote and to vote these people out, but it needs to be on both sides. Every Democrat that takes AIPAC money, every Republican that takes AIPAC money, every single one of them should be voted out of office. And quite frankly, besides the different Arabic communities and Muslim communities that are coming out and speaking against what's happening in Gaza, you still have, sadly, it's a lot of Jewish people like Jeffrey Sachs, myself, many others. I'm just like a little small cog in the wheel here, but that are speaking up for the rights of Palestinians, both in Palestine, also the people in Lebanon and Syria, all these different countries, and now Iran being attacked to overthrow them. But Iran is pushing back. And oddly enough, that may be the one country that does put a very crippling blow to it, as Chuck Baldwin said on our program yesterday. Let me ask you this, Carrie. And you please comment on this as well once, I'll let you speak on that there, and then I'll go to the next one because the other one's going to shift into the amendment itself. I want to ask you about. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think with Iran, I think that is what we're seeing. We're seeing so much devastation happening, and I honestly feel like the American people are being lied to, and President Trump is saying every day that we're winning the war, we're doing so great. But if you look at Iran, you look at the devastation they've been able to inflict on Israeli and U.S. Military power. I don't think we are winning, and I think that I think this entire thing will change the world forever, and change how these dynamics come to play forever. And the United States is essentially, it feels like they're being dumped by Israel. The United States, I don't think how we can support we can support Israel for much longer without any repercussions. This war is completely devastating for the United States, and it's baffling why we even got into it. And I think that really speaks to the power of the Israeli lobby. Like, we had no interest being in this war. We had no interest in any of our continuation of the war. We could have stopped on day 2, and we quote unquote were supposed to have regime change, and we got regime change, and then we're like, no, let's continue. I think all of this, and then these ceasefire talks that seem to be happening, but that also seem to not be happening. I think the U.S. is grasping at straws here, and I think we're really worried that this war was, essentially the beginning of our downfall, and we were gonna have to pay for it for years and years to come. And I really do think Iran is changing the global map. Changing how things are playing out. Like you said, they are one of the only countries that have stood up to the United States. And obviously, I think many people think that just because I'm supporting Iran's right to fight back against U.S. and Israeli aggression, that I support the regime, that I support, the things they've committed against their people, which I don't. And I think most Muslims would say that we don't support, what has been happening to the Iranian people. But at the same time, we're very grateful that, someone is standing up to Israel and that someone is standing up for those hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who have been arrested, who have been killed, who have been just atrocious things happening to them by the Israeli government. And there's finally one government who's standing up to that. And I think people are hopeful that this will, crush Israeli power in the future. It will crush the U.S.-Israel allyship. And I'm hopeful too. I'm hopeful that the United States will finally realize this is, a liability for us. We can't, even domestic policy wise, like our domestic policy is being so shaped by this foreign country when it is not in our best interest. Foreign policy wise, we're being, they're being controlled into engaging in all of these different aggressions just because of Israel. And I think America's going to realize that, especially the new generation coming up. We have so many young senators, so many young Congress people who are coming up who are not interested in having Israel control their policies and control what they're doing. And I think we'll see that happen. We'll see that happen within a generation or two, that the United States is going to be completely, disillusioned with Israel. We're going to slowly pull back from our ties with Israel. And I hope that happens.
I can certainly see that. And it kind of reminds me a little bit with Charlie Kirk. And, he was very pro-Zionist, but it seems like once the Gaza war began, things began to shape his mind differently. He seemed to at least have the understanding you cannot just genocide a people. You cannot just shoot children in their heads. And I mean, it just tears my heart apart to think of what these people have gone through. And I know some of them there in Gaza. I've interviewed journalists from there, and and I still can't wrap my mind around it. And I've seen a lot of bad things in life, but that's still beyond anything I could ever fathom. But I think that's what cost him his life. He didn't want to go to war with Iran. He knew that Iran was not any existential threat to the United States and that we were basically just pandering to Israel and Netanyahu's lifelong dream to go attack Iran. And I think it's not Jeffrey Sachs, but General Wesley Clark that said they wanted to take down 7 nations in 5 years. And what did the nations do? Nothing. What made them so evil? Nothing. And there's a few people that actually stood up, like you had, people like, oh gosh, Pape, I can't think of his first name. And then you had
Ilan Pape?
Yes, Ilan Pape, and many others. And we've interviewed a lot of these people here that are Israeli, but and with Ilan Pape, his sister, her daughter was lost in a suicide bombing, and she blamed the Israeli government for this happening.
Was that Miko Peled? I
Yes.
think that was Miko Peled.
Oh, Miko Peled, that's right, Miko Peled. Thank you. And but the thing that really strikes me is, and I heard Carrier Boller make a comment one day. I was actually during the hearing that caused all the whole board, with exception of yourself, turning against her, was because she challenged Israel's right to exist. I actually wrote an article on that on Substack, and because she's exactly right. There is no biblical mandate for the modern state of Israel, period. Even if you look at what Moses said, there's no biblical mandate. He said what would happen when they did their ultimate crime or violating their covenants. And but the point being here, though, is that Israel in 1948, they like to say this is a war of independence. That's not a war of independence. Even the early founders of Zionism all called it a war of colonialism, and that's exactly what it was. The Nakba itself was that would have been a war of independence. That was the indigenous people of this land fighting for their own existence and their own livelihood. And ever since Israel became a nation in 1948, they have only done nothing but oppress the people, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, to such a horrible extent. The brutality, the torture, the imprisoning of children, the torture of children. And I can't, for the life of me, Samira, understand what has happened to Christians and granted, not all of them do support this. Many of them are waking up. but why would the quote unquote Zionist evangelicals still, after all this horror, and now with Gaza laying in total ruins, still sound the praises of Israel? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I really think it does speak to the influence of Israel in US government and in US culture and society, but I think also it speaks to the intentions and the goals of prominent Christian Zionists who are, pushing this narrative and really pushing, their congregations to, fall into this ideology and to kind of not go against the status quo here. I mean, we've there have been messages, documented messages, emailing prominent Christian pastors that by Israel and Israel affiliates that if you promote Israel, if you speak against, I think they had one at some point. If you speak against Candace Owens, we'll pay you to do that. So this is documented that they're actively influencing, churches and congregants of different churches. They're geofencing different churches in certain areas, trying to push Israeli propaganda to churchgoers who are in those particular churches. So I think it's very, very clear that they're targeting Christian Zionists, and they have been targeting Christian Zionists for a long time. The Reverend Robert Owen Smith, he's an amazing researcher on this topic and on the topic of Christian Zionism. I would really encourage people to go look into his work, because I think it's very important to understand the history of Christian Zionism. It doesn't start in the 20th century even. It doesn't start in
Yes.
recent years. It starts way, way back in at least the 1600s with this, this rise of Protestants, this rise of new ideologies surrounding the Jews and surrounding Europe. And Christian Zionism really comes out of that kind of environment, and it really sticks into the consciousness of Christians throughout throughout the migration of European Christians to the United States, and throughout the formation of the United States, Christian Zionism becomes very embedded into Christian ideology, which I personally believe that it's not inherent to Christianity. I don't think Zionism is inherent to Christianity in any way, shape, or form. And I'm really concerned for Christians who are, reading their scriptures that have been altered, that have explicitly been, mistranslated to get them to believe in Christian Zionism. And I would also challenge Christians that if you believe your scripture is, teaches you that, yes, the Dome of the Rock needs to be torn down for the end times to come, for the Antichrist to come, and for, the end times, I'm really questioning, well, even if that's true, why do you want it to happen? Why are you hastening it on? Like, why are you killing children and advocating for such violence for the end times to come? Like, don't you want to fight for a better world? Don't you want to come to God with a clean heart? I don't understand that portion of it, even if it's true. Even Muslims, we do believe that the Antichrist will come. We do believe that the Messiah will come and defeat the Antichrist, and we believe similarly with our eschatology. But we don't believe that we should hasten that on. And we don't believe that it's moral or just in any way to promote atrocities and to promote these things in the name of God, in the name of our religion, to, hasten on such a terrible end times situation.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And this is something, Samira, that I have been working very deeply on. And it's something that I thought, even like whether it be Tucker or Candace, or even Carrie herself, wanting to try to help throw in some very key points, because I do understand the Hebrew language. I understand the Aramaic language in Daniel, which is odd in itself, because in Daniel 7:25, when it talks about the one that thinks he'll change the time, it doesn't say the word law. It's a Persian word. It says decree. The word dat is decree. And it says he'd wear down the saints. So, it almost, I said about a year ago that I believe that there's going to be someone that's going to come along that's going to try to say that Cyrus's decree for rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem and the Jewish people going back to their homeland, 2,500 years ago, that they're going to try to come along and alter that timeline, because that's literally what it says in Aramaic. That's an Aramaic passage. And it's, like I said, a Persian word that's being used. And oddly enough, The Sanhedrin comes out at I think it's on January the 16th of this year. It's published in Israel 365, and they were calling on the Iranian people to overthrow the Ayatollah, to take control of their government, to set up the 7 Noahide laws, just like Texas is trying to, was being done today by Dan Patrick, and to reestablish the third temple on the Temple Mount. And so you're right. No, there's no call biblically whatsoever for this destruction of the Dome of the Rock. It's preposterous, but it is something that they will try to do. And the other one I think that's fascinating is this one that they love to throw out there, Genesis 12:3. And they don't even know how to quote it. It says, whoever blesses Israel, God will bless. Whoever curses Israel, God will curse. One, it doesn't say that. It says only to Abram, to him alone. It's a singular when he speaks there in the Hebrew language. And it's all about protecting that promised child, literally the child promised from Genesis to the woman's seed, that child or the Messiah that would come. And for Christians, it is believed that that was Jesus that would actually come. So he gives that promise there. He skips over Isaac, never repeats it with Isaac. Jacob, it's said again, because again, is to protect the child. And the fulfillment was actually with Pharaoh and Amalek when they tried to take Sarah, his wife, because they weren't supposed to. That was protecting that child. But oddly enough, and I'll throw this in there and then yield back to you on this, in Deuteronomy, there's a beautiful place in Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 30, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's verse 18 in Deuteronomy. I'm just going to pull it up real quick. This is what's interesting. They like to quote it, as they said, misquote it. If you bless Israel, God will bless you, and if you curse Israel, God's going to curse you. And that's what Ted Cruz said to Tucker Carlson. Well, Moses flips it. And I know that the Muslims believe Moses to be a prophet, just like they also venerate Jesus and Mary as well. Whereas, Talmudic rabbis turn around and put Jesus in a very unpleasant place. But when we get to Deuteronomy there and we see there, he actually says that he'll set before them a blessing and a curse, and also life and death. And I think it's rather fascinating that the way that was worded, and I got it here now, I declare unto you this day that you shall surely, no, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong place there. It's verse 19. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, and I have set before thee life and death and the blessing and the curse. So Moses flips it. Now Israel could get cursed. And I personally think that's when they were faced with Jesus and Barabbas. Which one would they choose? And so this whole ideology that you got to bless the modern state of Israel, who's out there committing genocide to the world and has no respect for any nation. They're just trying to follow the Yiddnon plan and overtaking Lebanon, Syria, all the way over to the Nile and going down into Egypt probably will be next without a doubt. Things that were fulfilled, that was fulfilled in Acts when, the gospel went to those regions there. So I totally disagree with it. And I really think that it would help if there could be some educational aspect, just some basics like that could help some of these people that are like yourself. You have a much better handle on this than most people that I've seen out there already understanding how that these things are true. And but like Carrie, and she knows, but what are some of those key points that you could argue back for those people that are trying to say that you've got to bless Israel when in fact it has nothing to do with that?
I mean, yeah, I think just an understanding that the original language of these texts is different from translations, and they have different implications and understandings than these translations. And any translation, you should understand who the translator is, understand their context and their background, and kind of what their thinking is. And this is a conversation that Muslims have all the time, because we recite our holy book in the original Arabic, and it's really encouraged to recite and understand Arabic for Muslims. So many of us learn the original language that the holy book, the Quran, was revealed in, and then we study it that way, because there is this understanding that translations can really alter the understanding, and that whoever is preaching to you can really alter your understanding if you're not educated yourself. So I would really I really encourage Christians to be educated in their own faith, to learn Hebrew, learn Aramaic, like you have, learn Greek, understand the original languages of your texts and be familiar with that and come to your own conclusions. And I think maybe the Catholics will disagree with me on this. They're less text heavy and personal interpretation of texts, but for evangelicals and for Protestants, I think that's in your purview, that as a Protestant, you should study your own texts yourself with integrity and with an eye to the truth. I think so many people kind of read translations, and it can be a big task, learn a whole new language to how to understand your religion. But I would challenge you that if your religion is very central to who you are as a person, then I think it's worth putting in that effort and worth putting in, the effort to understand God and as you view him, and understand what your religion says. And I think if you don't, have the time or effort to put in, I think just look to scholars out there who have. There are many, biblical scholars themselves who are explaining the translations, or explaining how these misinterpretations happen. And people like you, I think, are doing a great job of, talking to Christians and explaining the, understanding of the Bible and how to understand it. So I guess that's just, my advice. And I really think as well on the Muslim side of things, I think people should understand, like you mentioned, how we view Jesus and how we interact with Christians. We have explicitly in our texts, "Laysu sawa'a." We don't believe all people of the book are the same. We don't believe that every single Jew or Christian is a genocidal maniac. We don't believe that, and we certainly don't act on that. And we really do believe that there are Christians and there are Jews who are really sympathetic to the truth, and who are really sympathetic to Islam and Muslims, and who care about us and who love us, and we love them, simply because that we know that we live in a world that we need to get along in, and we need to work with each other against these real forces of evil. And yes, I guess that's my thoughts on that.
You made a perfect nominee for this board had they had enough insight to be able to take in consideration what you were saying. Let's move to the First Amendment. Strictly forbids the government from establishing a state religion. In your experience, has Zionism effectively become the established faith of this commission, where criticizing a foreign government, i.e., Israel, is now treated as a violation of religious protocol?
Yes, I think it has. And I think it's very clear with what happened with Carrie. And I think people have tried to say, oh, she got fired because of how her conduct during that hearing, or because she said certain things to the witnesses. But I think if you look at the full story, you'll know that's completely untrue, especially because they asked her to resign back in August, not because she said anything to witnesses, not because she said anything in her capacity as a commission member, but because she posted about Gaza and the suffering of innocent Palestinians on her social media. She posted on social media about Gaza, and that's what they asked her to resign over. So I think it's very clear that her theology and her beliefs about Gaza and Palestine were what caused her to be removed. And that is very concerning for anyone who has any, sense of justice in their body, that this is not a commission interested in protecting religious liberty. And I think it also shows the fact that they had an entire hearing on anti-Semitism that wasn't speaking to true anti-Semitism. It spoke to Israel and protecting Israel's interests. Many of the commission members didn't speak to their individual experiences of anti-Semitism, or even if they did, they brought up the fact that we needed to adopt IHRA, which explicitly protects this idea that you have to be, supportive of Israel. They wanted to, push forth and that definition of anti-Semitism. And then if they did, they also brought up October 7th and Hamas, which had no reason being in a hearing on anti-Semitism in America. That had no reason being mentioned at all. And I think if you wanted to talk to the anti-Semitism that has risen since October 7th, that's perfectly valid. There has been a lot of anti-Semitic sentiments and anti-Semitic attacks since October 7th. But I think it's not fair to say that that you can't condemn genocide even if you're against anti-Semitism. That's not fair. And I don't think they allowed that voice to be heard at all. And even when they were, when Carrie spoke Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro's words, who was an anti-Zionist Jewish rabbi, she spoke his words on stage, that a statement that he gave to her. They were very concerned. They kind of didn't respond to his words at all. They kind of tried to slander him and discredit him, even though what he said was essentially, I'm an American, I am Jewish, and I don't think the state of Israel speaks for me, and I don't think my my life as a Jew in America should be associated with Israel at all. And that's what he said, and that's what they pushed back against. That's one of the witnesses they didn't accept because, in my view, that's what they felt that he would say on stage, that he would push back against this narrative that you have to be a Zionist in order to support Jews, which is completely false.
And that's so true. And like you said, yes, there are some anti-Semitism that's going out there, and it's becoming more, I would say, more prevalent because of what's happening in Gaza, and people are angry. But at the same time, there's a lot of people, a lot of activists that are trying to do things very, you know, exposing these things that should have a right to have a voice too. And it shouldn't just be that Israel is the only religious right that has the authority to become the number one beacon that's going to determine what religious liberty is in America. I think it's Shulamite, I can't think of her last name, Aloni, I think was her name. She actually on Democracy Now! Had said that anti-Semitism was a trick. It was a trick word used. Another guy was he was former Mossad. I can't, gosh, he was a Polish guy, I believe, and I can't think. Oh wait a minute, Pete. I remember it now. Pete Makaki. No, I'm sorry. No, that's what they called it. It was Victor Ostrovsky, I think is his name. And he also would say, as a Mossad agent, they would see someone starting to speak against Israel, and they would contact the paper because, if he'd be a journalist, and they would label him an anti-Semite, and that would brand him to where he could never work again. So this has been a trick, and it's been exposed by Israelis saying that that's what's going on. So I think at the same time, when I watched Carrier Prejean Boller, and I literally watched that entire discourse that was happening there. And as you pointed out, she was already being drugged in by Paula White and I believe it was Dan Patrick, if I remember right, where they were wanting to throw her off the board because her views didn't align with the president's views. And I think it was Paula White that said to her, that you're to protect the president.
This
I'm
was
like,
Dan Patrick who said that.
okay,
Yeah.
how absurd though, right? How absurd could that be, Samira, that, to think, I mean, even from your perspective on as being appointed to this board, to know that, this would apply to her, to you as well, that you really don't have a voice. You're just there to protect the president. Then what's this about in the first place then?
Yeah, I mean, it is very clear it didn't matter. I mean, and that's also being a Muslim and being visibly Muslim on something like this. I think they were hoping that me being there would kind of give them purview to speak against Muslims or speak against Islam, and that, oh, we have a Muslim here, so it's okay that we say these things. But I wasn't willing to go along with just what they said against Muslims, against Palestinians, and I think that they were hoping that I would be quiet and that I wouldn't say anything, but I did. I came out with a statement immediately after Dan Patrick announced Carrie's removal. I came out with a statement then. I came out and I resigned shortly after that when she was removed by Donald Trump. So I think they're a bit frustrated on that end that, we brought in this Muslim who was not supposed to do anything and wasn't supposed to say anything. She was just there to get the optics right, that we're allowed to speak on Palestine and Muslims without any repercussions because we have a Muslim there. And I think they often do that, and they pull these kinds of tricks to get approval for the things that they're doing. And if there are any Muslims listening, I would really encourage you to think through these alliances and think through what people are asking you to do when they ask you to be a part of these organizations or be a part of these boards. Obviously, I joined because I felt like I could make a difference. I felt like We had seen so many, and I would consider myself generally conservative. We had seen so many conservatives flip on the issue of Palestine. We saw, I mean, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Thomas Massey, Marjorie Taylor Greene. There were so many people who were changing their minds, and I felt like on this board that people would hear me out, that potentially I could make a difference. And when I saw that I couldn't make a difference any longer, they weren't listening to anything that I was saying, I felt like that was my time to leave. But I do want to point out though the fact that and people have questioned, okay, yes, it's about religious liberty. Why are you talking about Palestine? I want to point out the fact that Palestine, and specifically for Muslims and of course other people of faith, is inherently linked to our faith tradition. And when Muslims are not allowed to speak about Palestine openly, that is part of hindering our religious liberty. Muslims pray for Palestine all the time. Just today, I saw a pamphlet in a mosque that had a prayer for Palestine on it, and it was encouraging congregants to pray for Palestine. And if Muslims aren't allowed to do that publicly and openly, which is the promise of religious freedom in America, then how are we supposed to, accept that we have religious freedom? How are we supposed to say that we're defending the First Amendment when that's not allowed to happen? And we've seen this over and over again, that they try to silence, when it comes to Judaism and when it comes to anti-Semitism, Zionists use the cover of religious freedom, and they use the cover of protecting a religious community in order to silence criticism of Israel. But the opposite doesn't happen. When Palestinians are attacked, Palestinian Americans are attacked, when Muslims affiliated with Palestine or speaking up for Palestine in any way are attacked, it's not an Islamophobic attack. They don't call it an attack against Muslims. They aren't sympathetic towards the Muslim community. They say, oh, this was a foreigner. This was related to foreign interests. This was related to, something that has nothing to do with America. But it's the fact that, one, we're Muslim, and Muslims our entire lives, we've prayed for Palestine. I think that's part of the issue. We've never given up that view of Palestinians as worthy of human dignity. But two, we are very public and very vocal in our communities on this issue. And if you've seen, actually just today, I believe Nerdine Kiswani, she's a Palestinian American Muslim activist. There was a threat against her life that was foiled by the FBI. So they actually arrested someone who was planning to bomb her house. And these things aren't treated as, they're not treated as hate crimes. They're not treated as someone who's tied to terrorist activities. He's not, the perpetrator was Jewish. He's not labeled as a Jewish terrorist. He's simply labeled as, some misguided kid who wanted to bomb someone's house. That's unacceptable. And when it's the other way around, we don't treat Muslims the same way that we treat people of any other religion in this country. And that's an affront to religious liberty, and it's an affront to our values as Americans.
That's so true. And it's interesting, like you said, it'll just be pushed under the rug when it comes to Carrie. But if it's on a synagogue or something like that, it becomes the end of the world. I want to just the first part, of the First Amendment: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And, the founding fathers, they knew all too well what had happened in Europe already while they were coming from there, how that Rome for nearly 1,000 years had controlled everything that happened in the state. And so they were trying to bring together a community, although maybe many of them were Christian, maybe some of them were agnostic. We don't necessarily know every view, but the point was they didn't want one particular religion having a dominance in this nation. And that's what a Religious Liberties Commission really should be about. But obviously, and as you mentioned earlier, we're talking about Palestinian rights because it concerns Muslims, and it should concern Christians and Jewish people in this country, which there are those that do speak out against this as well, and our voices should be able to be heard. So with you guys being on this Religious Liberty Commission, and you're hearing from the people out there that this is a problem, we don't want to see this happening, it should be something that should have been brought. And interestingly enough, Carrie's guest that she had invited, and I don't know if you had done that as well, but they wouldn't even allow them to come and speak because I guess they were afraid of what they might say. It was clearly a one-sided pro-Zionist argument. And, I have no problem with, okay, a pro-Zionist being on this committee if that's the case, but there should be an equality of voices in there. And it shouldn't have nothing to do with protecting the image of Donald Trump. I mean, to me, that's a tarnished image in itself already, but that's a different subject altogether. With that being said, Carrie Prejean Boller was ousted for her Catholic conscience, specifically the belief that Catholicism and Zionism are incompatible. As a Muslim, why was it so important for you to stand with a Catholic activist? Because in this fight, what does her removal say about the safety of any person of faith in America today?
Yeah, I think it was very important that I stood with her. Even though we have different faiths, and me and Carrie have become good friends since, and we've talked about the differences in our faiths, and we had long conversations about theology and practice. But I think it was very important to stand with her because as a Muslim, in the Quran, explicitly, God tells us to stand for justice, even if it's against your own self or your own relatives. So with a strong sense of justice, I felt like, I had to stand with her. No matter who she was speaking out against these atrocities, anyone who speaks out against these atrocities, and I, stayed silent when she was being, attacked for that courageous and righteous stance, I felt like I had to stand with her. As a Muslim, it's my responsibility to stand with those who stand for justice. And so I felt very obligated to do that and very grateful that Carrie was willing to do that. And yeah, I guess that's just Muslims have a very strong set of principles when it comes to justice, and I think we've seen that with how many Muslims speak out for Palestine and how many Muslims every day protest and speak up. And I think as a Muslim, I wouldn't be doing justice to my faith if I were to lay down and stay silent when something like this is happening. And I think of the story of Moses with Pharaoh. And I don't know if I don't know if you've seen my testimony to the Religious Liberty Commission, but I began it with a prayer that Moses made when he was tasked with standing up to Pharaoh, where he asks God to open his chest, make his affair easy for him, untie the knot from his tongue, and so that they might understand me. And I really take inspiration from Moses as well, that when standing in the face of oppressors, when standing up against these so-called powerful people who could, potentially ruin my career, accuse me of different actions that obviously slander me, which they've tried to slander me and attack me. But that's no excuse to not stand for what God calls us to.
I think that's so commendable, so very commendable of you. And, and I definitely get it. And I understand, Samira, because, even for our family, we have stood for the Palestinian people. We don't, even though we know, okay, there's Christians, there's Muslims there, I don't even think about it in that terms unless I'm trying to make a point with Christians that are just sitting there forgetting, oh, well, what about what about at least your brothers and sisters? If you don't care about the rest of the people, what about them? But for us, it's humanity, period.
Yeah.
And you've got to stand for humanity. You've got to stand for what's right, because if you don't, you'll be next.
Yeah.
Because at this point here, and I have two more questions for you, and I won't hold you much longer. But in that final hearing, did you see that the definition of anti-Semitism being weaponized, and was it being used to protect the Jewish people from hate, or was it being used as a legal shield to silence anyone, Jewish, Christian, or Muslim for that matter, who questions the actions of the state of Israel?
Yeah, it was definitely not the IHRA definition, and I would encourage people to go look it up and read through it. It mentions so many things that are not directly related towards, protecting Jewish people from hatred and from attacks. I think it mentions Bible verses. It mentions this idea of Jews killing Jesus, which is a Christian teaching that many Christians hold, that is not allowed under IHRA. It mentions criticism of the state of Israel as part of anti-Semitism, which is completely false. And we have American Jews and prominent American Jewish rabbis coming out and saying that that's false. So I think it really does warp what is considered hatred. And in this country, I mean, technically under free speech laws, we're allowed to hate anyone we want. But when it comes to propping up a definition by the federal government that the federal government holds as what we consider anti-Semitism, or what we consider within the realm of quote unquote hatred towards Jews, that that includes so many additions to it that aren't directly related to protecting Jews. And like I mentioned, many Jews have said that this definition doesn't protect us because we ourselves criticize Israel and we are called self-hating Jews for standing up for Palestinians and for standing up for innocent lives. It's definitely not meant to protect Jews, and it's meant to push political, a certain political view. And that is what was being asked of the commission on that day, to fully support this law and get behind it in the name of religious liberty, when it is an affront to religious liberty. That definition is an affront to religious liberty.
The one thing that gets me, and I'm going to ask you this last question here, is that I've also watched where people like when Tucker was doing the interview with Mike Huckabee, and they're trying to do this narrow window of defining Zionism because they want to pretty much put everybody in their little trap. And he says, let's first start off by defining Zionism. And he asked, do you believe that Israel has a right to exist? I kind of like what Miss Albanese had to say about that. She said, they exist. Mm-hmm. She said, Rome exists. Italy exists. France exists. It's not a matter, do they have a right to exist? My thought would be, does Palestine have a right to exist? That's really where that question should be directed at. But nonetheless, Zionism is not that narrow of a definition. It is much broader, but they're trying to do this so that they can shut everybody up. And, and I think that where the problem comes in, and this has really got a lot to do with my last question for you, is when you made a statement, I support America over Israel. And that is something that I so wholeheartedly agree with. And America is not being put first. The administration right now, and practically at least every Republican politician, is 100% on board with following Trump and following Israel to the very ends of the earth, to wage war and to kill people that they had no justification for whatsoever. Can you comment on these issues?
Yeah, I think the whole right to exist discussion is a distraction. It takes away from every single atrocity that the Israeli settlers have committed since the inception of the state, when radical Jewish terrorists bombed British infrastructure and actively, killed civilians then, to up until now when they're committing a genocide against Gazans. I think if you say that, if you move the discussion from what is acceptable morally to what is acceptable politically, I think that really takes away agency from the innocent people who are being killed, and from the innocent people who have to face these atrocities every single day. And I think that's what they try to do. They take every discussion and move it from a moral argument to a political one. But it's interesting too, because even in the political realm, they lose the argument there every time. I mean, politically, we operate under the UN Charter with the idea of sovereign nation states, and Palestine was its own state for so long, and they came in and settled the state. They pushed out Palestinians from their own land. They pushed them out 48, 67, and now what they're doing in Lebanon, they're trying to push into the south of Lebanon. They have constantly done these things. And when you say, Israel has a right to exist, what is Israel? What is considered Israel? What is considered the state of Israel? Do we accept the borders that have been drawn by Israelis, or do we understand that these have been drawn illegally in many cases? They've they have gained their land illegally in many cases. And so even legally, what do you mean they have, in what capacity do you believe that in their existence? And what capacity do you believe in their ability to continue committing these atrocities to expand their existence? I think that is the bigger question. It's Zionism, like you mentioned, is not simply, I believe in the dignity of Israelis, I believe in the dignity of the Jewish people. That's not Zionism. That's not Zionism. I think most people would agree with that. But why we oppose Zionism specifically is because it leads to the killing of innocents, and it leads to the stealing of their land, the stealing of their homes, the erasure of their people. They're trying to actively erase Palestinian culture. I think that's also another aspect of it. People often call it the quote unquote Arab-Israeli conflict. And I don't like to use that terminology because it erases the fact that Palestinians have a distinct identity in history and culture and they've had it for so long. And the Israelis actively. So I guess that's my response to the whole right to exist discussion. I think it's a distraction.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much. I think in my final thought here, in the words of Yaakov Sharit, the son of the former Prime Minister of Israel, Moshe Sharit, Haaretz had interviewed him it's about 5 years ago now. And the title of the article was a quotation of his. He said, "Israel was born in sin. I'm collaborating with a criminal country." And I agree with him. He talks about that when his family had moved there much earlier than the Jews from Europe had come. And he talked about the Nakba. And he said he has so much regrets. He talked about a Bedouin friend of his that he'd met. And I remember meeting a Bedouin one time that was so precious. I could feel for what he was saying when he said this. And, but he said there were 250,000 Arabic people living in the Negev at that time, where he was tasked to overthrow these people. And there were only 5,000 of them, but he said in this interview, I encourage people to go to really look at what he says here, because the admissions that are coming out and of the people that are regretting what happened, it lets you know Israel was never created. It's not a biblical mandate for this day and age. Carrie was so right on that. I know it really because I've been studying the Hebrew language for almost 40 years of my life, so I understand it extremely well. And I've been trying to undo all the Zionistic nonsense we were into, and I'm so grateful to my wife for helping to open my own eyes on this. And also, I think the war with Bashar al-Assad and falsely being accused of gassing his people when it was actually Israeli-backed militants that they had brought into the country to do so. But I really want to thank you so much for coming on, Sameerah, and sharing your testimony with us here. And we'll push it everywhere we can. I hope that more people will interview you, because your voice is extremely important. The world needs to hear what you have to say, because you truly are a religious liberty advocate. And I think that this board lost a tremendous person when you resigned, and as well as Carrie, where it would have helped bring more balance. And that's what this board really needed. So unfortunately, it looks like it was just created for Zionist propaganda, quite frankly.
Yeah, and thank you for having me, and thank you to you and your wife for the work that you do. And I'm really grateful that people are speaking up. I think for so long, many Muslims have thought, where are the rest of the people? Where are the Christians? Where are the Jews? Where are they? We felt so isolated, and I think many people are waking up to the idea that the hatred of Muslims is because of Zionism, and more people are opposing Zionism, and more people are opposing the atrocities of Israel. So I'm really grateful for the work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you guys for listening today. Sameerah Munshi, you will find her. I'll have the links below for you on X and on Instagram. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah,
If
thank
you can
you.
wait just 1 second.